Hi, and welcome to Imagine Live, a brand new series of broadcasts from Ericsson, where we will be inviting you to share your thoughts about a future of unlimited connectivity. Is it true that anything we can imagine we can achieve? Well, that is what we are here to find out. We're going to be taking live questions throughout this broadcast on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, so please do open up your imaginations and tell us what you're thinking. I see, have viewers joining in from Brazil and France and Sweden. Please do make your voices heard throughout, because today we're talking about education and how it might be transformed by hybrid learning and the metaverse. Will completely immersive digital environments help democratize access to people and resources and enable people to learn vocationally without having to travel to specialist physical locations? And will this new model replace traditional or classroom learning, or are we looking at an increasingly hybrid education world? Well, let us find out. And to help me today answer those questions and yours, please welcome my two esteemed guests. I am delighted to see Niklas Heuveldop, the Senior Vice President and Head of Market Area North America at Ericsson. And I believe, Niklas, you are in New York, same place as me.
I am. Thanks for having us, Alex.
Oh, I'm so delighted to have you here, because we've spoken before on some of Ericsson's programs, and I know that our conversation is really rich. There's going to be a lot for our viewers to ask about. And joining us today for our feisty conversation also is Thomas Davin, who is the Global Innovation Director from UNICEF, and you're coming to us from Stockholm, I believe, Thomas.
Indeed. Sunny Stockholm. Very pleased to be in the program with you.
That is fantastic. Well, I want to remind our viewers that we are taking questions live on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So please drop them in throughout the program. So, education is changing. Traditional classrooms are being transformed into hybrid learning environments. Thomas, what is driving that change?
So, I think the change has been going on for some time. I think if you look at, the MOOC classroom types, etc., there's been a ton of innovation happening in education throughout for the last decades. But when you look at that new type of outlets, I would suggest maybe a few parameters for change. The first one is it starts from a place of pain, I would say, because when you look at the world around, we are facing a learning crisis. And that is simply because those children going to school, I'm not talking about those who are not even in school, but even for those going to school, the learning outcomes, what they learn from going to school, are very, very poor. If you take one example today, we have about 70% of children who are 10-year-old in lowest income, middle income setting in the world, in countries in the world, who are in school. So 70% of children who are in school who are 10 can read a text, but they cannot explain to you the text that they read. So we are facing with a genuine crisis. And so we must evolve, we must innovate, we must look at other ways to give them access to those learning outcomes and new ways. The second reason is maybe with the world of today. The world of today is a world where information moves fast, where most young children and adolescents are on screen in one way or another. They're getting used to social media. Those social media are updated very, very frequently, nearly every second. And so you need to look at things, opportunities that are more interactive than just a teacher that is going to ask you rote learning. It just doesn't work for these young children anymore. It doesn't resonate. It doesn't get them engaged. And so it's a matter of trying to find new ways for them to be in the classroom and to get their brains in gear.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there is this combination of meeting people where they are, but also at the same time developing technologies that work to the skills that we are seeking to develop. And a lot of that, Niklas, has to do with connectivity and has to do with the technologies that are coming into the classroom. Thomas mentioned MOOCs. This is something that is, educators have been using these types of technologies for a long time. But when we're talking about hybrid learning, we're talking about something a little bit different. What are the drivers that you see for bringing technologies into the classrooms?
Well, it has certainly accelerated now, of course, at the back end of COVID. So we've seen technology playing an increasing role in education for obvious reasons. We have had a lot of hundreds of millions of school children across the world that haven't been able to go to the classroom. So, of course, the hybrid learning using virtual technology, learning platforms has taken an increasingly important role in education. And you can think of it in a number of dimensions. So first, of course, you have the in-classroom experience, where you can augment the physical learning experience with virtual technology. So we have done some work on how teachers can be better prepared, leveraging technology to give classes. You can use technology such as AI, machine learning, to tailor education content to children with certain needs. So you can adapt your curriculum to students. And then, of course, something we have had to work on a lot over the last 2-3 years is connecting school children, students, when they are not able to go to school, so at home, leveraging technology. So virtual certainly plays an increasingly important role in the classroom and outside the classroom. And if you play that forward, you can actually see education technology enabling lifelong learning in a very different way. So we're no longer just targeting school children or university students, but we can actually make education available to all of us, leveraging these very same technologies. Yes, it starts with connectivity, but we'll talk about some other fundamental enablers.
Yeah, Thomas, the hybrid learning experiences that we're seeing now, to what degree are they different than, say, in 2018, 2017, before a lot of the Western world was rushed into an accelerated online learning environment?
I think what you have is a lot more acceptance by teachers, by communities of parents, by public authorities as well. We've seen massive investments in education technology, what we call edtech, because of COVID, and suddenly you have a realization that where many of us, who are invested in education were there before, but by many more people now saying, well, actually, we have the technology to bring a different kind of classroom. We have the technology today to revolutionize the education sector, and that should be welcome, because in a number of countries where connectivity exists, we can then get to a stage where we can bring that technology in service to the child, but also in service to the teacher, frankly, and in service to the communities. And so I think the key change has been that acceptance, that realization that tech for good is actually doable in the education sector, is actually just at our fingertips. And then now the next stage is, well, do we have the right kind of content? Do we have the right kind of training for these teachers? Do we have, the appropriate platforms to do that? And finally, and that's the most important, of course, does that result in a shift in learning outcomes? And that is the very most important. And I'm, of course, talking about all of those who are connected, all of those whose schools is connected, have the means to connect to these platforms, to these tech solutions that are not free in general. So I'm not talking about all of those communities in the Global South, broadly speaking, but not only the Global South, that are simply currently not connected at all, or that are connected but not with the right kind of connectivity layers, or are connected but not have the means to find the right solutions that could underpin these learning outcome shift.
We're going to talk a little bit more about this much more apparent and emerging digital divide after we thought that we'd come up with solutions for that. It seems that this is a great case study where that divide still exists, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm wondering, though, we do have a video, and I'd love to know, is this what learning will look like in the future? Well, I'm excited about that. It looks an awful lot like, real immersive learning, but there are issues associated with that. And that has to do very much, Niklas, with this idea of connectivity and getting that technology in the hands of kids and indeed the teachers just simply into classrooms. And I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are on how to deal with the challenges of the fact that technology is simply not evenly distributed.
There are a number of challenges, so maybe we can start with a basic challenge, to your point, connectivity. And of course, we have still 3 billion people worldwide that are not leveraging broadband connectivity, and there's hundreds of millions of school kids that don't have access to internet broadband connectivity. We did some work here during the COVID crisis, and it is pretty shocking that in the greater Dallas Metroplex, which you can argue is a very well-developed city, over 23% of African-American students did not have access to internet broadband. So we can start in our own backyard, and it starts with connectivity. That's the first and most important thing. We need to make sure that there is connectivity. Doing a lot of work with UNICEF on that. We're very excited about our GIGA partnership. We're one of the first private sector companies to step in with the multi-million-dollar investments to make sure that all schools around the world are connected to start with. And then, of course, we can't stop there. We need to make sure that children are connected at home as well. So the connectivity part is a huge effort for all of us to make sure connectivity is there. Then we need to make sure there is affordable rate plans so that students across the world can use that network connectivity. Devices is going to be the next challenge. Then we need to make sure there is education platforms and content built on top of that. And then, of course, we'll probably need a lot of mentorship and other initiatives to make sure that teachers, students alike know how to leverage that technology that we are putting in place for them, right? So there is, of course, it's a couple of horizons or sequence of steps that need to be put in place. And that's, of course, something we're working hard on with some of our initiatives. Mentioned the partnership with UNICEF here, Thomas, a team that we're super excited about.
Well, actually, we've got a couple of questions that speak exactly to the points that you raised. Patricia from New York says, I used to be a teacher before retiring a few years ago, so I've never really experienced doing hybrid learning. It seems there could be a burden on the teacher here. Is that fair to say? I'm going to throw this one to you, Thomas.
So yes, totally, and this is what we see when we are talking to communities that are connected in countries that have that connectivity. Is that a key principle, and I really believe that a key principle is that the edtech progress in edtech has enabled the opportunities for us to really leapfrog the kind of progress that children who are left behind currently could actually attain in terms of learning outcomes. However, that technology has to work primarily for the teachers. The teacher has to feel that technology is helpful, it is useful, and it makes their job easier, and also ideally more enjoyable. And my strong belief is that we can use machine learning and technology to do a number of repeat tasks that are actually quite cumbersome and difficult and heavy-handed for the teachers, and free the teachers' time to do focus for children who are maybe struggling on some items or another, and to work on the type of skills that children will always need and will be absolutely necessary for the future: teamwork, analytical thinking, critical thinking, empathy, thinking critically about any problem statement that is given to them. All of those are elements that machines will always struggle to really transmit and carry to the children. So the ideal point and the optimum landing stage is one where tech is an enabler and an enhancer and an accelerator, and not indeed an added weight to the teachers, because we know how many teachers are struggling with their day-to-day. We actually have a crisis for teaching as well. Many teachers nowadays don't want to teach anymore, and we struggle in many countries to find teachers simply because they feel it's a profession where rewards are far and few between, and payroll is crap. And, you know, what you really get out of that is not always easy for them to see. So we need to make it work for them primarily.
You tapped into something there that I think really is important that we remember when we talk about anything to do with bringing new technologies into the classroom. And that is, what is the intention of education, right? What 21st century skills that we talk about, you know, when we talk about education, that we really are meeting by bringing the technologies into the classroom. And before the pandemic, arguably, we had a list of skills. You mentioned some of them. You know, it's things to do with critical thinking, you know, being able to be a worker in the workplace of the future. But now, post-pandemic, we realize something else. And this is something that Carl on LinkedIn raised. He says, what about the social aspects of school? Can everything be duplicated by hybrid experiences? And what do we need to know now that children will need as working adults in the future to do with mental resilience and those things that we've discovered just interacting via technology is not going to meet? Thomas, I'm going to come to you first with this one.
So definitely, we need to reflect on the law of unintended consequence. And I'll give you maybe one example around that. When I was based in Thailand, we were working on teenage pregnancies. And we were trying to understand why the rates of teenage pregnancies in Thailand at that time were quite high, and trying to figure out how is that possible when the rate of access to internet connectivity is very high in Thailand. The rate of primary and even secondary high school access was quite high, and access to internet was very high. Children of about 12 to 16-year-old would spend about 40 hours per week on internet. And so we started doing interviews with these teenage mom and trying to understand how is it that happened to you when you had all of the information available on your fingertip. And what they were saying was, actually, I was so much online that all my social clues were online. And so when I had a problem or conflict or disagreement with somebody, I would unfriend them, I would stop reading their text, I would simply move to another platform and just move on to other people that I felt more comfortable with. And when I was in my living room with my boyfriend, I just didn't have the clues to tell him that I didn't consent, that I was not in agreement, that I did not want to go as far as he had intended, and I just didn't know how to say no. So all of those clues are going to be so important, and online will just not be enough. We need a moment of socialization. We know that by now, that e-learning is not good enough. That full immersion is great for some things, but you will need the teacher, you will need the group, you will need those social clues to understand how to work in life. You will also need to probably develop a lot more grit, because children of this generation are going to move through a lot more jobs in their lifetime than our generation has. There's a number of new skills that they're going to have to: emotional intelligence, mental health, grit as well, and resilience. Some of these are going to, also come clearer to us as this generation develops, because we are also discovering what that will mean.
Yes, it's quite a longitudinal study, is it not? I think something there that is important to remember is friction. And the metaverse that we describe is often a place where we can seamlessly and easily move between space to space. And I think, when we're talking about social media, it's quite obvious that we are ignoring friction. We're avoiding friction. How, Niklas, in your conception of the metaverse, where we will be engaging in this kind of hybrid learning, where that is where a lot of our education would be, how do you see that space promoting and enhancing the outcomes or the digital skills that people will need as they move into the future of the workplace?
Fascinating question. I'll just build on something you said, both of you. I think of all the digital skills, also based on the examples Thomas just gave, critical thinking, I think, is really where we need to make sure we equip the next generation, because they're being spoon-fed so much information, and teenagers can easily drift away unless we keep them, enable them, and coach them for critical thinking. I think we run a high risk to mental health problems, like you discussed. New York Times did some interesting work with the Childhood Foundation on online abuse of children as well. So same thing here. I mean, critical thinking is probably the most important of all skills that we need to make sure we equip our children with. And I actually think the transition to a more metaverse-like experience, think of it as deep immersive learning experiences, where now all of a sudden with the haptic internet or the internet of senses, you can actually, which was also part of what you were showing in the video, you can actually touch, sense, feel, and smell. And Stanford did some interesting research where if you can augment the learning experience with a deep immersive experiential learning experience, you increase the retention of what you learn by up to 78%. So it's a significant improvement of your learning experience if you can add some of these experiential learning episodes. I keep giving the example of if I could equip my grandchildren, my children are too old, so they've already burnt their fingers, but if I could equip my grandchildren with a haptic glove and have them touch a virtual stove, they could experience the burning sensation themselves without actually getting burnt. You could have school children go and visit the dinosaurs with Sir Attenborough in a virtual world and spend time observing the glaciers, or just live through experiences that have fundamentally improved lives, but also take them through some of the greatest atrocities of mankind. So spending a day in Auschwitz, for instance. So this whole notion that you can offer deep immersive learning experiences where you can learn from what others have already been through is a significant, I think, improvement to the general education and learning experience. I think we could leave the next generation off at a very different starting point, entering their careers, their work lives, than where we ended up coming out of high school, for instance, with a much richer learning experience. And I think that is also, that experiential learning is probably also how we will approach critical thinking and training them critical thinking, the consequences of not applying critical thinking through role play. I think technology can play a really big role in that.
We've got a provocative question from Anand, both provocative and fun. He asked, Niklas, are we going to have an Ericsson metaverse with classrooms and practice labs to go to? Will it be designed and run by Ericsson with Ericsson in mind and Ericsson in practice?
Well, there could probably be a section in the metaverse. If you read about the metaverse, it's not supposed to be all homogeneous. So there is probably going to be parts and pieces of it. I think I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but what I can tell you is that through our Connect to Learn initiative, which we started some decades ago, we have started taking small steps in that sense. So we have trained, 300 teachers, to one of the questions we got earlier, with virtual reality to experience the in-classroom teaching session, get instant feedback, learn how to leverage technology in the teaching session. We have developed programs for young students, kids, where they can start experimenting with robotics and some other sort of technology to get them interested in STEM sciences, STEM careers. And then, of course, maybe to your question, we've also worked on training programs for, call it at university level, where we're bringing in 5G, IoT, AI, machine learning, edge compute technologies to train and prepare students with some of that online training for careers in STEM, right? So, I mean, yes, we are working on putting the tooling in place, the education platforms, and of course, contributing with content where I know we have a thought leadership piece and can contribute.
Well, let's have a quick look at an example where BT's 5G network enabled a live virtual tour of Raglan Castle in Wales, coupled with an immersive classroom environment. We talked a little bit about how the metaverse builds on the shoulders of previous experiments. So I'm wondering, what have these done, Thomas, to successfully promote this 21st century skills agenda? And what gaps is hybrid learning filling?
Well, that's a tough one. In my mind, I would say that it was already a kind of hybrid learning. It was not just as experiential as Niklas was describing, and indeed not. You wouldn't have the haptic gloves, etc. But you would have a measure of I think hybrid learning, except not as in depth as what that is offered right now. But I do think you had a possibility for children largely from the most wealthy quintile of the societies to be able to have machine learning helping them in their exercises at home, accessing school classrooms remotely. And you saw the difference when COVID hit, where schools and communities suddenly just shifted to that seamlessly, and we're able to largely maintain, I would say, the coherence of the classroom. I think for the most part, and that I think is an interesting thought process for all of us, for the most part, it did have an impact on children that was largely unforeseen, right? The grades largely dropped, even in these most affluent communities that had access to these, hybrid learning environments, that had access to the best support systems. The grades generally dropped. The mental health impact on most children was very significant. And indeed, as UNICEF, we are anticipating a lot more of mental health issues moving forward. I think what we have in what we are looking at today is a much more immersive, and indeed, as the Stanford study was looking into, if done right and if done in a right framing as well, we could see that fully immersive engagement gives access to all senses, engagement, and experiences in ways that seem to impact positively on children's ability to learn and on their learning outcomes and on their confidence about what they've seen and what they retain. And that is no surprise, right? Because in education throughout, we've always said, what you hear once is very different than what you read and write, and what you read, write, or experience yourself. This is all kinds of education, modalities, and we've always known that once you experience something yourself, your brain retains the lessons much longer, much more effectively, and with much more acuity than when you either just hear it from the teacher or when you hear it and write it yourself. So though, there are levels of engagement that we see that with much excitement from a UNICEF perspective, that ability to use tech and even to go to that stage. We just want it to be accessible to everyone and not just to, the top 1% of all societies.
We've got some great comments to that end. We've got people talking about how this can be, this can enable, teachers who are stressed out, as John shared on LinkedIn from Jamaica, and Fiona from Fiona from Vodafone is also talking about how this can be augmented, for example, for kids who are on the spectrum. So it provides a really rich environment for very personalized learning experiences, which again has been a fascinating trend and an interesting, important trend in terms of creating those critical learning outcomes. But now we're moving into a more practical part of the conversation, and so many of the questions that I am receiving now are speaking to that. We know the metaverse brings with it a plethora of good ideas, but really, how do we implement this in education? And there's a great question here from Priya, and it cuts straight to the chase, Niklas. What about security and data collection when it comes to the metaverse? Could information be used against students?
I mean, it's probably one of the biggest questions we're dealing with. It's data privacy, integrity, security, online safety, on security. And this is an area where we are doing quite some work between us, several agencies, and actually policymakers around the world. I mean, I mentioned the example of child online exploitation. Turns out the bad guys have a lot more data protection and privacy rights than the children actually being abused online. So there is a number of policy questions that we have not been able to solve yet. So this is a big effort between us providing technology, operators building out the networks, it's education, ed tech providers providing the proper education tools. And then how do you deliver those education services with the right integrity and security provisions? It's not unique to the education sector, so I don't know if it's any comforting, but of course this is a bigger question. It goes across industry, public sector transformation, healthcare, manufacturing, transport. So we see some of the same challenges across sectors. So this is, of course, a much bigger topic that a lot of very smart people are working on. It's complicated. And I think there is a huge effort here between us and the private sector, working with public sector policymakers around the globe to make sure that we find the right provisions to enable these type of experiences in a safe, secure fashion, right? I mean, it's a big job and something we've been working on. And what we see is that there is a lot you can do in private networks to start with. That's where we, for instance, see smart manufacturing taking off. It's in a dedicated private network, so you have full security, integrity. I do not rule out that you could see similar implementations, for instance, taking a school at a time. So we'll have to figure out a good path forward where we can try building the capabilities. Once we put capabilities like this in place, proof of concepts, if you wish, policymakers can also start making sense of it and probably appreciate better the type of legislation, the type of policies we need to protect school children, students, and also adults, of course, and for lifelong learning, right? So it's a very good question.
Yeah.
A lot of work remains to be done.
Privacy. It is, and I think privacy and security is one of the buckets of practicalities. One of the issues when we look at this. Another one is what we were talking about before, which is this idea of the digital divide. You know, the metaverse has been criticized in the past for not being accessible to everybody, and when it does come to connectivity, which we've all mentioned before, that's an area where people will not have equal access. And we have a great question from Oya on LinkedIn asking, how is it connecting schools in various countries around the world? Are there some places that have more challenges than others? How is it specifically connecting schools in Turkey? And Niklas, I'm going to ask you to respond to this because you've got being Ericsson, you've got a better idea of how the connectivity is coming along.
No, it's an excellent question. And this is, again, something where our Connect to Learn initiative started, must be 3 decades ago. And it was primarily targeted at Africa and South Asia at the time. And that is the challenge, is basically how do you provide connectivity where there is no good connectivity today? And we've done some work, I believe it is with UNICEF as well, keep me honest, Thomas, but the to reach 90% population coverage with high quality broadband internet connectivity, we're looking at $428 billion investment between private and public sectors across the globe. 2/3 of that is already planned between now and 2030. So there is a lot of operators around the world, industry already working on expanding the coverage, making sure that the digital divide is being addressed across hundreds of countries around the world. And for instance, in the US, there is a big effort now, the broadband infrastructure program, for exactly that reason, to build out that connectivity. Then there is 1/3 of that that doesn't make sense for our customers to build. And this is where private-public partnerships and government funding plays an important role. So it's a whole of country kind of effort between private sector, public sector to build out that connectivity. I think we have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done where. Then, of course, we come back to the device, the affordability of plans, and then making the content available at the end of the day. So it's a big effort between the private sector, the public sector, policymakers to make it happen. But I think we finally now, after many years, have a good idea of where we need to build the connectivity, what type of connectivity, what are the capabilities that we need to put in place. Now, I'm not going to represent here now, since this is being recorded, that the Metaverse is going to be generally available to 8 billion persons across the globe anytime soon. But I think in the education sector, it's reasonable to expect that once we have a school connected, that school will be able to leverage Metaverse-type immersive learning experiences. Doesn't mean that all the school kids will be able to benefit from it at home as well. The Metaverse and some of the experiences we've talked about are probably some of the more extreme and bandwidth demanding, connectivity demanding use cases that we can think of. But again, I think it, just like today, I mean, it's the video from BT actually, that is something that you should be able to experience also at home at the end of the day. That is pretty basic connectivity. That's not the deep immersive haptic Internet of Senses type experiences that we're talking about. Those may start in the schools before they become more broadly available. But it is just like today, it's going to be hard work from a lot of us to make it happen.
And there are many comments in the chat on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter about that. For example, Stephen from Facebook says, the digital divide is real. We have schools without electricity, and where most teachers do not have higher education, most people in our country do not have smartphones. How, Thomas, will they not be left behind? How do you ensure that the 21st century skills agenda facilitated by hybrid learning is not something that is based on technological access or even skills?
So there's a mixture of strategies that we are trying to really deploy. The first one is very much with Ericsson and other partners around really connecting schools, those schools that are not connected. You know, about 2/3 of children in the world today don't have connectivity at home. And so connecting the school is the first starting point. It's enabling that school to give them access to some technology, some possibility of hybrid learning. We are working very hard with other partners, Microsoft and others, to develop solutions that children can then bring, or at least enable at school once that school is connected, and then bring it offline and still have access to some degree of hybrid education opportunities when they're offline at home. And then they bring it back, and then it connects to the server when they're back at school. We also believe that those schools connected will bring access to many more opportunities for young people of maybe informal education or learnings that may be enabled by private sector partners or others. So that is really the first step. Once that exists, we're really then working in trying to understand how do we use technology, machine learning, AI, robotics, to accelerate the pace of learning outcomes for children, and again, to free up the hours of the teachers in different ways and to enable them to focus on real problems for children or children suffering in one particular theme or sector, and really enabling the teacher to play the role that they should be enabled to play around the kind of skill set that machines don't have the means to do. And trying to essentially use then that connectivity layer, that opportunity of access to the right kind of technology that UNICEF would have essentially tested and proven in terms of learning outcomes, worth and credibility, to leapfrog the gap that they currently have with other, society components that already have access to that, but may not have access to the right kind of technological solution. We have to be honest that today in the world, the edtech sector is about $250 billion worth of investment last year, roughly speaking. Of that, when you look at the impact for children, only about a quarter of the private sector partners using these edtech solutions agree to share the learning outcomes, a quarter of that. Of these, only half of those have been evaluated for impact. And of these, about half, again, are actually demonstrating some kind of impact on learning outcomes. So, tech right now is not a panacea. We need to be able to dive into it and figure out what is the right tech and what is the tech that is actually going to be helpful to children. And it's not all tech. And so that's part of what we hope as UNICEF to play a role in, to be helpful in trying to connect these schools and then bring the right kind of tech solutions to help teachers be comfortable with them and feel that they're actually playing a role of leading these children to the next century and not themselves being left behind.
Absolutely. I think that is such a crucial and critical part of this, is allowing the teachers to feel comfortable, make the onboarding process as easy as possible so that they can spend the rest of the time doing the soft skills that they know that they need to do when they're in the classroom, which leads me nicely on to a question for you, Niklas, which is about Connect to Learn at Ericsson. If teachers are stressed out, as some of our contributors and some of our viewers have mentioned, is Connect to Learn the right action for teachers to engage with? Tell me a little bit about the program.
Well, Connect to Learn is something that we have been working on then for about 3 decades. It doesn't solve all of the challenges and problems we've talked about, but I think think of it as our contribution to teachers, young school children, university students, but also mentorship programs. So there is elements of content that we have developed for teachers to learn about virtual learning experiences, technology in learning, and it hopefully will help address the stress that teachers can feel by an ever-increasing push for more technology in also education. You can role play, you can play through classroom experiences and get feedback on how you're performing, adapt your learning teaching as such. So that is definitely part of what we have put in place. And then I did mention earlier also some of the things we have done for young school children to get them excited about STEM, older students to learn about more advanced technology that they can benefit from in working life. But then there is also another element. So there's 4, think of it as modules in Connect to Learn, which is about mentoring. And we have made a lot of Ericsson volunteers available to students and teachers as part of this shift to an increased role for technology in education. So we're trying to do our part. I'm not going to represent problems, but I think it's a very good starting point that we can work on together. We have been working on very diligently in the more challenging environments, in really make sure we understand the needs for teachers, for instance, in more stressful, more exposed, less well-equipped, well-funded schools around the globe.
Well, thank you to Niklas and Thomas and to everybody who enriched this conversation by sending in questions. I have to say that we've talked a lot about the challenges. We've talked about some of the solutions. We came back to the challenges and we ultimately came back to some solutions. So if you've enjoyed this broadcast, please do keep commenting and sharing. I have really enjoyed imagining a future in which everyone everywhere has access to the world's best education, and even more so when you consider that we have many of the tools and indeed the connectivity needed to deliver a completely inclusive and universal learning. Please do join us for our next broadcast on the 19th of May, when we will be looking at the Internet of Senses, something I'm very excited about, and how that will help us to reimagine the world of entertainment. We'll see you then.